Next speaker is David O'Brien. He's probably familiar to us all as the Deputy Leader of the National Party in the Legislative Council and National Party Whip in the Legislative Council from 2010 to 2014. He also served on the Accountability and Oversight Committee, Family and Community Development Committee, Legal and Social Issues Committee, Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, and as Chair of the Rural and Regional Committee. As a barrister, he's appeared in the High Court, the Supreme Court, VCAT and other planning panels, and he's also well known as a national mediator. So it's a great privilege also to welcome you, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very generous welcome, Charlie. Thank you. And thank you to the Chair, Don Kane, and to Paddy Dewan. I see Dr. Peter Lazary, who's both a friend and an in-law of mine, so I acknowledge Peter and others in the audience as well. We can talk about attribution error, and I don't know, that's the first I've heard that anything I had said individually had much of an impact outside the hallowed walls of my 4 years in Parliament, but if that's the case and it served justice in your case, Paddy, I'm very grateful. But I'm here to talk about really a report that was done by a committee I was on. I did have 4 years in Parliament, and that was a worthwhile experience, and I urge all of you to consider finding a way into the Victorian Upper House. It's one of our lesser known parliamentary jurisdictions, and it does give you a great opportunity to work in areas you haven't had much former experience. One of them for me was the medical profession. Further disclosure, I have three brothers who are doctors and a sister who's a medical neurologist or neuropsychologist, I think. So I had some familiarity with the medical profession, but it's over the dinner time conversation, which is of course where you do hear lots of things. But it is, I think, part of what I'll talk to you about today, and I do have a few PowerPoints, and I'll start to go through them if I can. Down, that'll do it. The key finding of our inquiry's report, which heard about 55 submissions, it sat between 2013 and 2014, and it focused on the role of AHPRA from a state point of view. And the key finding there was that despite the consolidation of all the state and territory boards into AHPRA and some of the benefits that have been occurred by the national scheme, it remained a large and complex bureaucracy with potential confusion over lines of responsibility and accountability. And that's both for the medical profession, but also for the public at large, a continuing problem. I would like to probably look at the issue a little bit deeper in relation to the cause of this problem. I don't believe there's evil people setting up evil bureaucracies to make all our lives hell, much as those who have to deal with those bureaucracies sometimes feel that that is the case. What happens is these things develop as a result of the tension between the subject matter of what you're trying to deal with, particularly by regulation. And I have had a relatively rare experience in Victoria these days of actively working in the courts and in the Parliament. A lot of the lawyers in Parliament do not actually spend much time in the court-based aspect of the profession. So the tension between fact-finding and subsequent regulation is something I do focus my attention on, and particularly in a federal system. And I think the heart of the problem for the medical profession in this area is that medicine, the human body, is inherently complex, and it's a very difficult thing to properly regulate because you're dealing not only with human health and human health issues at the cutting edge with specialists and experts who have had many years of training and are fundamentally very hard-working and in the vast majority of cases do an excellent job. You've also got the situation of people's concerns over their lives and their relatives, so it's an area where there will be people looking at what's happened. And of course it's an area that has got state and federal regulation, which makes it extremely complicated. And I think all these things were thrown up in the AHPRA inquiry. In short compass, with the takeover of the federal boards, the state boards into a federal body, you had a situation where there was concern over the efficiency at the federal level of such an organisation. This actually formed a concern as to whether we should do the inquiry, which is why there was actually a lot of debate in Parliament. It was why is the state government looking at this, or state upper house looking at this? And to me, that was actually a very important role that we did play. I am a bit of a federalist. I'm actually a localist or a regionalist. I support, I believe decision-making at the local level, wherever listened to and properly supported, is often the closest to the source of a problem. And that's why I do tend to support state and even local government decisions more than federal. But this ties into this issue. The medical profession is itself largely still state-run. And one of the submitters, I can't remember who it was, and I tried to find it, but gave us the example, and one of the benefits and the safeties of a federal system for Australia's healthcare system, which is internationally a very good healthcare system, but obviously still has these faults that we need to work on. One of the benefits from it is, in fact, our federal structure, whereby if there is a problem in one of the state regulators, well, if it is left at a state-based system, particularly in complaints and notification, well, that problem, in a sense, using medical terms and rather crassly, can be to some extent quarantined in that state, whilst other states may be insulated from that problem, be that, and I'm not going to, with the Queensland health issue, if you like, but there's always been other issues in Victoria as well. And likewise, on the positive side, under a state-based system, the states can in fact lead, provide leadership, provide innovation, yes, compete with each other, but do so in a way, with 8 or 9 states, it's beyond oligopolistic numbers, which are about 3 or 4, where you get anti-competitive behaviour. You really get quite a healthy structure under our federal system. And of course there's a role for a national regulator, and there was very clear that the benefits of the national system are sufficient, that there is not a momentum from the profession or anyone really to walk away from that, but to certainly recognise that the system is complex. You've got people reporting on people on very high issues, therefore it is very hard for a jury system, for a court, for a judge, for a doctor, for even one specialist or another, for a regulator to actually get to the bottom of who is right or wrong in any factual scenario. And whether it's a peer review or not, the difference between a fact and opinion, which is a great debate in law, and proactive regulation and responsive common sense approach, which sometimes goes against a regulation to get to an outcome, which you all know about is potentially necessary in an emergency situation. That is a very hard decision to define, which is why you do need bodies like yours to continually shine a light on injustice, and I particularly value the role of whistleblowers. I know Peter has had that role in life. I'm sure others here have. I can see people putting up their hands. I didn't know Emil Popovic, but my brother was associated with him, and I was involved in the Catholic Church paedophilia exposure in the parliamentary inquiry we were on then. I know the valuable role that whistleblowers and your organisation does. So working through then what we looked at in the inquiry, that was the rationale, principally to look at how it affects the public as its ultimate concern. Obviously, AHPRA is not a standalone entity. There's still the ongoing bodies. I think 81 went into 14, which is a fair rationalisation, but there's still a lot involved in the national law, and you'll still have an important role for some of those state bodies. Protection of the public, obviously the paramount consideration, and all very important to keep in mind, and that's where bureaucracies can, in a sense, sometimes take over and become self-perpetuating. I'm a big decentralisation fan, where you can find an active role. I supported the establishment of the NDIA in Geelong, where it happens to be where I live, but Geelong has had a long history with disability work. It's not that far from Melbourne, and it's got a great supportive network, and for a city like Geelong, that is a sensible role for even a federal body to have a headquarters, and we hope that plays out. Looking at the health professional issues, the benefits, I think, have to be acknowledged, and they are things that the federal government and the federal body can regulate well, which is national accreditation, enhanced mobility and flexibility, operational efficiencies. Now that's a theoretical one that in fact in the first few years of AHPRA proved quite the opposite. It blew out, and our study looked at that, and registration fees came in. One of our recommendations, which I'll get to hopefully with time, was that there be a cap on increases of registration fees to CPI. And that's something that politicians like to do every now and then when they believe that independent regulators are getting a little bit bureaucratic, can be regarded as a bit crude. The reason for that, though, is it enforces efficiencies within the organisation that they have to cause to meet. One of the matters that was identified with AHPRA is that they had about $81 million in investments, and there was queries whether a medical body needs to be looking at that sort of thing. I don't want to be overly critical of any individuals in AHPRA. I think these things are a result of defining role, and certainly it was a massive task to try to set up a regulator in the time they did. And also there was some transparency issues that we identified about a failure to report in annual reports, for example, as to the number of meetings and number of staff that they had. Those sort of transparency measures are indicative of accountability of a regulator, which is its fundamental task to not just the profession that it regulates, but of course the public. So the issues, I think you'll be aware of these from other speakers, but we identified, or submitters to us identified, time delays with the complaints process. And bear in mind this is 2013-14, but these, I read the recent Nick Xenophon committee report. I see these issues are still present. Inadequate communication and responsiveness, lack of transparency and accountability, that's part of the issues that Russell was talking about in terms of natural justice, inconsistent decision making and the need for greater cost efficiencies. Tending to the heart of the matter in relation to AHPRA's notification and complaints role, which is where we saw the greatest potential for reform. It was identified that about 1/3 of all notifications about health practitioners were initially referred to the health complaints entities. Again, a bit of a teething issue, but probably where we came from. I should say when we, this is unfortunate in parliamentary inquiries where there isn't a unified position amongst all the MPs. Most of the inquiries that I worked on, we actually were able to achieve that, including very controversial matters, including looking at Mikey, who actually worked across the political spectrum, and that's a great role for backbenchers. This one was handed down just before the election. Unfortunately, we split on the key recommendation, and that was done at the last minute. I'm not putting blame, it just split along party lines, with the coalition recommending a consideration of looking at going to what they call the co-regulatory model, which is close to the Queensland and New South Wales state regulatory role for the complaints and notifications, and closer to what you had before AHPRA. And the Labor members didn't agree with that. I don't think the Green member agreed either. And that means that I'll just do it, this is my one physical thing, the inquiry then sinks like a stone. And that's basic what's happened to the recommendations, but they remain obviously for consideration. There'll be a state election. I don't think I'll be there, but there'll be a state election in 2018, and these issues can be lobbied in terms of parties' positions as they run into the election. Should that be where you want to go? So looking at the notification issues, there were time delays, and this is a significant indicator of a failure of natural justice. If there's failures to report back to particularly people who've been complained about, but also the notifiers, and a sort of secrecy, lack of transparency, information coming in, evidence gathering, but not much coming out. It's generally indicative of problems. We've seen that probably in the Employee Fair Work body, as it's done some of its very long investigations, and a streamlining of that process and a greater involvement of the professionals at an earlier stage, where it be proper peer reviewing, earlier mediations. These sort of details I think are best left to each individual profession in the end, because there might be in a certain specialty only 4 or 5 doctors in the country who have expertise on a particular type of procedure. It becomes a very difficult area to regulate, especially if those 4 or 5 doctors, 2 or 3 of them may not get along or have differing views about where the science is heading. And we just have to acknowledge that that is the patient we're dealing with. So how do you deal with that? Well, you try to make it fair. You look at things like whistleblowing, you look at behaviour like bullying, you look at the examples of Emil Popovics, where not only was he bullied in the medical profession, probably bullied in the parliament as well, which I did do a small amount to try to remedy a bit. But those are the matters that you've got to look at. It was also noted that even for the notification reviewers, that there were fewer rights than they had previously. Now, for some in the profession, say, why would you necessarily be concerned about the rights of reviewers? Well, if it's a fairer system for those notifying, then there's more faith in the system, less resort to the courts, because just because someone hasn't been given a right of appeal by the AHPRA process, if you like, it doesn't mean they won't resort to a court proceeding anyway, and or the regulator hasn't tried to overly consider their role in the decisions they've made to compensate for the fact that they don't have a right of review. So we identified that as an area that it may sound a bit perverse, but if you give all sides, because there can be problems, obviously there can be situations of cost of life, and I don't want to go to specifics in this forum, but you all know those situations, and you do need to treat everyone fairly, including the notifying system fairly. We looked at the New South Wales model, which the difference between New South Wales and Queensland, as I understand it, it's very complex, is the New South Wales system never really went into the AHPRA regulated model. It stayed as a co-regulatory jurisdiction, whereas Queensland went in and then effectively, well, at the time we did our report, was considering going out. But we considered that it was, again, under this federal system and the opportunity to look at states where the regulatory system was working better in a complaints sense or a notification sense, we thought that it had some benefits. And as I say, the majority of the committee looked at the co-regulatory model and made a recommendation that this be considered by the state minister. And one of the big problems with federal regulation and federal systems, and we have it emerging in the legal profession as well, is you obviously, to get serious change, you need all states to agree. So in terms of a regulatory reform, if we're looking at some of the recommendations that Russell has talked about, you need not just Victoria to consider it's the way to go, you've got to get it through the national bodies and the national states. And we all know the politics that can play on there between different states. It just takes longer. It's just more complex, and it's harder to get that targeted reform. So ultimately, the key recommendation of the report was, in my view, was that we consider looking at a co-regulatory model. That sounds complex, but it's not that much. It's you have national accreditation, so you join a national body. There is a role for the federal or the national system, but you then look at much more targeted, localised reform on the complaints and notification procedures in particular. And you allow Victoria's health system, which is the most significant contributor in terms of both regulation and actual money from the Victorian government, to be working much closely with the Victorian courts and VCAT to improve and continually improve identified faults in the system. Something to consider. I haven't really seen it debated. There was an academic, a Monash paper, who did a review on our report. To be fair, they found it a bit light on and a bit thin. That might be fair. I think the role of parliamentary reports is not to provide documents of answers. We're like a jury system. Ordinary people become members of parliament, sometimes very ordinary, but that's a good part of the system. It actually sheds a light. What I think parliamentary committees can do better than a court, better than a royal commission, better than many other committees, is shed a light from the public. It can allow the public's views, and it can allow ordinary people to have a great say, probably better than any other forum. Plus, it tends to be close to the legislators as well as the media, which can be very important in these roles. But in relation to where it goes from here, it'll be up to, effectively, you people to agitate for such a change to be implemented, if that's what you thought appropriate for Victoria. We also looked at there was the issue of international medical graduates, and we recommended changes to the ratio there. An issue, again, I still remain, as I say, I'm not an MP anymore, but I advocate very extensively for the work of our rural doctors. We had an excellent submission from the Rural Doctors Network, and without giving Dr. Lazary another plug, because I'll have to get a coffee from him later if I do one more, but he did an excellent job when he was in his role in the Rural Doctors Network, and I think that's an important other body. The challenges of decentralising medicine are a huge challenge, because you've got the highest knowledge, and that naturally concentrates to the city, but you've got the actual people living out there who need access to medicine. And obviously there was concerns in the stall situation for Dr. Obi. You know that whatever your view on the rights or wrong, that dispute went on for many years. all through my time in Parliament, very hard to get an answer as to who's right or wrong from the system. And meanwhile, Stawell Hospital, a major hospital with a maternity ward, doesn't have a certified, please help me with the word, delivers babies, obstetrician, thank you. The last but important, the second last important changes was to the registration fees, where I mentioned in opening. No greater than CPI. Again, it's done when we think a regulator needs a bit of control. I don't think it was adopted. They had, to be fair to AHPRA again, they had said that in the last few years they had tried to keep their increases after the initial bubble to CPI. I don't know how that's continued, but I know that's an important issue. A very important aspect of the Victorian system, again, a Victorian initiative that we recommended that be specifically funded, is the Victorian Doctors' Health Complaints Network. Not complaints, the service that looks after the health of doctors. I can't remember the actual name, it's not in my recommendation. Program, thank you. We received a lot of evidence that it provides the supporting welfare needs to doctors and nurses and all medical professionals, and knowing the stresses of the life I've led, and seeing my brothers and sisters and seeing all of the medical professionals, it is a very, it's naturally stressful job, and you can't hide that stress. It's the nature of the work that's going on, but you should support that. I think there's going to be discussion about the situation for Emerald Popovic tonight. I don't want to preempt Paddy tonight, but I know that all of us need to help each other, and I really recommend that this conference continue, and no matter what they might say about you individually or collectively, and I don't know what they are, but it is very important to have people taking on the system. It is an extremely important role, and without that the system does not improve, and more often than not you guys are right. Thank you.